the notion of these things that exist that are clearly born of mythology, right? These are things that are believed in because we want them to exist, right? We want gods to exist. We want magic sky daddy to look after us.
A lot of people don't want to know. That's the thing. They don't want to know facts. They want to remain in their story time place where they will go to heaven and frolic among their loved ones for eternity.
Yeah.
But I'm also a fucking adult that can look at reality and go, yeah, we all die. That's the thing that happens.
Dave Farina, better known by his channel name Professor Dave Explains, started out by creating science education videos, but recently he has been more popular for debunking pseudoscience. He consistently promotes the notion that religion is wishful thinking for weak-minded individuals, while scientism is for intellectually superior people who are strong enough to deal with harsh realities. In this video, I will argue that Dave's radical scientism is poorly justified and that his dismissive attitude to religion is not much more sophisticated than that of the science deniers whom he so disdains. First, let's examine the role that faith plays in science.
Science is antithetical to faith. It is the precise opposite of faith. It is evidence-based and reason-based. It is data-driven, right? This is what the data suggests. So we don't have faith in anything. Science is the faith does not enter into it for a single second. We gather data, and this is what the data suggests. So this is the current scientific consensus.
Physics students don't just sit there and take dictation. They do physics. They replicate landmark experiments from pioneers in physics and derive these laws for themselves.
So the claim is that faith plays no role in science, and that it relies only on evidence and reason. This is, of course, only true in an extremely narrow sense. Indeed, we formulate laws of nature based on what we've seen, not because someone received some personal divine revelation. But that's about it. When it comes to the origin of the scientific method, accepting currently established science, and developing science further, faith is unavoidable. Francis Bacon, who was one of the founders of the scientific method, was strongly motivated by his Christian beliefs. His belief that the human mind is fallible led him to advocate for careful observation rather than speculation. He believed it was a God-given task to properly understand creation, and that we are called to use that knowledge to help one another. Therefore, his Christian faith was a foundation for his philosophy of science. Without a faith-based belief in any sort of moral duty or commandment, what gives Dave, or anyone else, the grounds to tell people that they have to be rational, intellectually honest, or care about how their beliefs impact others? When we study the currently established science, we have faith that the knowledge has been properly documented and communicated. Of course, students do some experiments here and there to test tiny parts of physics theory, but students typically don't reproduce the works of Kepler and Newton from scratch. Students don't meticulously track the orbit of Mars with their telescope over several years to establish its elliptical orbit and verify that it is consistent with the inverse square law of gravity. Nor do students of elementary particle physics build a particle accelerator from scratch to verify that the zoo of particles truly exist. We have faith that observations and conclusions are passed down to us reliably, so that each individual does not have to reinvent the wheel. When we try to come up with new laws to describe observations, we are guided by our preconceived notions of what the law should look like. For example, Dirac found his equation by believing that laws of nature should display mathematical elegance. Einstein could not accept Max Born's probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics because he had faith that nature is deterministic. Steven Weinberg used to believe in an eternal universe because he had faith that Christianity is nonsense. Today, faith still determines how different people treat certain open questions. For example, whether a multiverse could explain the apparent fine-tuning of the universe for life, or whether there could be a connection between the seemingly probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics and our sensation of free will. So while, of course, science is not fully based on faith alone, faith definitely plays a substantial role. How does this compare to the role that faith plays in religion?
Religion has never, ever, ever seemed to me to be any different from other mythology. Like I regard Christian mythology the same way as I regard like Greek mythology. Like I grew up really adoring Greek mythology, and I was obsessed, and I read all the stories, and I knew all the names of all the gods and the heroes and stuff. They're stories, and that's how I've always viewed all religious mythology, all religious scripture, no matter what religion. So to me, it's always been perplexing, even at a very young age. I'm talking about 6 years old, just going like, hang on, there's all these stories, but you think these ones are true? Why?
Right.
Why do you think that? I don't get it. Like it was so strange.
So we see that since Dave treats religion with the sophistication of a 6-year-old, he is unable to rationally examine the differences between different religions. This displays the same level of intellect as saying that all scientific hypotheses are the same. There are so many different scientific hypotheses, and if so many hypotheses are false, why can't I just say that they're all false? If you dismiss the theory of the ether, why can't I then dismiss the theory of relativity? Obviously, different hypotheses turn out to be not the same if you take the time to study their details. Just because you're incapable or unwilling to do so doesn't mean that they are therefore equivalent. The same goes for comparing different religions. Christianity is not the same as all other religions. You can look at their differences and then conclude which is more likely to be true. For example, let's look at Luke's Gospel. He mentions very specific historical details of the time and location of where certain events happened. One can verify that this is consistent with other historical sources, and sometimes even corroborated with archaeological findings. The end of John's Gospel clearly reads as an eyewitness account that aims to transmit information correctly, rather than some grand mythology. That in itself might not convince someone that Christianity is true, but at any rate, it is absolutely absurd to say that the historical reliability of the Gospels is of the same level as that of Greek mythology. Or let's compare Christianity to Islam. The Gospels were written by people who knew Jesus personally and by people who had direct access to eyewitnesses. The Quran was written 600 years after Jesus, and somehow it contains extra information on Jesus that was not recorded in the original Gospels. One can examine this completely rationally. Which account of Jesus is more reliable? The one recorded by eyewitnesses, or one recorded 600 years later? To further elaborate on this point, one can look at what the Quran says about Mary, the mother of Jesus. In the Quran, Mary is called Maryam, and it says that Maryam has a brother named Harun, and her father is named Imran. The Gospels mention no such information. But the book of Exodus mentions that Moses had a sister named Miriam, a brother named Aaron, and a father named Amram. So on a purely rational basis, can we make any inference as to which account of Mary and Jesus is more reliable? Or should we blindly accept the conclusion of 6-year-old Dave that all religions are equally faith-based and that no rational inquiry whatsoever is possible? So there is faith in science, and there is reason in religion. But since Dave so adamantly insists on the importance of rationality, let's see whether he practices what he preaches.
From the Lagrangian density, the so-called field equation can be written. This is an equation analogous to the classical equations of motion that describes the objects and energy within a given quantum field. As a result, the Lagrangian density is often used to express quantum field theories. For the Lagrangian density, the formula for the Euler-Lagrange equations is the partial derivative with respect to mu of the derivative of the Lagrangian density with respect to the derivative with respect to mu of phi index I equals the partial derivative of the Lagrangian density with respect to phi index I. Phi index I is the quantum field, which can have n dimensions, so I can be any number between 1 and n. We can see that this looks somewhat like the classical Euler-Lagrange equations, but involving a derivative with respect to mu instead of time. If mu can only equal 0, the time derivative, this looks very much like the classical version. However, we must account for all of spacetime, so mu can equal 0 for the time derivative, and then 1, 2, or 3 for the three spatial dimensions x, y, and z.
There are several things we can observe about this video. First, what was said is factually incorrect. The formula does not turn a classical description into a quantum mechanical description. It turns particle dynamics into field dynamics, but the fields can still be completely classical. Moreover, it makes no sense to set the first mu equal to 0 and the second mu equal to 1, 2, 3. The Einstein summation convention dictates that you sum over all values of mu while the two mu's are equal to each other. So how did this mistake happen? Most likely, Dave had faith in the person who wrote this script. He did not critically test it or verify it with experiment. So if science is supposed to be all about observation and logic and not at all involve any faith, then Dave does not live up to the standard he sets. Moreover, when it comes to science communication, we see that no understanding is being conveyed. No coherent thought process is being explained to understand the formula. Dave just confidently dictates an intimidating formula which has to be accepted on the basis of authority. The comments to the video confirm this. People do not understand what is being said, but it sounds impressive. And because Dave uses big words, it means he must be very smart and always right. Dave uses similar intimidation tactics when commenting on people with different opinions.
All right, you're a mathematician. How improbable is life? Is there a way of quantifying
Well,
this?
it's extremely improbable. I think a very good example of a reaction to an early form of fine-tuning was Sir Fred Hoyle, who was an atheist and who was my examiner at Cambridge. And he predicted a resonance in carbon, which was later discovered. And when it was discovered, his reaction was, nothing shook my atheism like that discovery. Now, Sir Roger Penrose is one of the most...
Resonance in I don't even know what the fuck that means. What is he saying? I don't even know. And learning things about molecules and elements affects your atheism how? Wow, what a sad anecdote that was. That was a whole big old nothing burger. Amazing.
Here, Lennox mentions how carbon resonance could be seen as evidence for fine-tuning by an intelligent creator. If you don't know what carbon resonance is, or how it indicates fine-tuning, then it's indeed understandable that you can be skeptical of such a claim. So, how would a properly scientific-minded individual deal with this skepticism? Fortunately, It's very easy today to just look things up. You could study what carbon resonance is and try to understand how people relate it to fine-tuning. You could examine the arguments and then come to your own conclusion of whether that line of reasoning is satisfactory or not. But that's not the example that Dave the Science Communicator sets for his audience. Instead, he says, if you don't understand something, then you can ignore it. This is something that Dave does quite consistently.
Brilliant mathematicians of the world worked with Stephen Hawking and so on. And he has an analogy in his book where he says, if you want a universe with the second law of thermodynamics, where even your Cadillac will rust, everything is running down, the Creator's aim, and those are his words, he's not a believer in God, the Creator's aim must be accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123 in order to get our universe. And
big crazy numbers. Lennox doesn't know what the second law of thermodynamics says. That's part one. And then part two was to just pull a number out of his ass. God, second law of thermodynamics, which to the pseudoscience peddling charlatan of this variety means everything breaks down. That's what happens. Thermodynamics says everything breaks down. That's what entropy is. And then zero ability to, or zero tether whatsoever to 10 to the 10 to the 123, whatever the fuck. Like all they do is just say a big number. They just pull a big number out of their ass. It's incredible.
Again, you can quickly verify the quote and dive into details if you're interested. But apparently Dave knows everything, so if he doesn't understand what someone is saying, it must be nonsense.
In the light of modern science, the idea that the universe was created for humans is fucking stupid, quite frankly, and just indefensible. It's not compatible with modern knowledge, right? The idea that a god would create this unbelievably vast universe just to have a planet and put people on that, and okay, there you go. What's all this other crap? Don't worry about it. Nah, it's fine. It's not for you. It's just I made you over here on this one little planet. Enjoy that. Like, why would you believe? Why and where's all the life, right? I mean, if you want to talk about finely tuned for life, where the fuck is it? Most of the universe is vacuum of space. There's totally inhospitable to life. We don't see any life. We can't. It hasn't made itself known. That's for sure. Yeah.
And once more, we have an argument from arrogance. If Dave cannot understand the actions of God, then God cannot exist. A recurring theme in the Gospels is that Jesus defies human expectations and demonstrates that God's ways are higher than human ways. Because who would have expected that in order to be worshipped all around the world 2,000 years from now, you'd have to be a lowly carpenter who's publicly tortured, humiliated, and executed. This must have been very difficult to understand for early followers, who suffered greatly under Roman persecution. But we, today, have concrete and clear proof that this ridiculous plan somehow worked. Yet in spite of this evidence that has been made available to us, Dave insists, if he cannot understand God's mind, God cannot exist.
I don't understand it personally, so it can't be true.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's the assertion of your own profound ignorance over the totality of human knowledge. That's what's so arrogant about science deniers.
And this is a clear illustration of the hypocrisy of Dave. He ridicules pseudoscientists for dismissing everything they can't understand, but Dave himself does this again and again with religion, or basically any argument that opposes his scientism. One might argue that even though his critique of religion is rather weak, at least it's a good thing to promote respect for scientific expertise and authority and to condemn pseudoscience. But also here, it turns out that it's ultimately Dave's authority that matters. Dave decides which scientific authorities matter and which can be ignored.
I was responding to the fallout of the Freedom from Religion Foundation debacle with Richard Dawkins, Jerry Coyne, Steven Pinker, who unfortunately represent the part of the intelligentsia that is swinging this anti-woke way, pseudoscientific way. The right is using trans issues to polarize people to the right by offering these ridiculous straw men of like, liberals think men can have babies and they don't, there's 27 genders or whatever the hell. Has nothing to do with any of that. All we're saying is that there is sex and there's gender identity. Sex refers to a suite of biological characteristics. It is definitely, first of all, it's not binary. They like to say that it's just gametes, right? You got sperm or egg. Well, that doesn't work because prepubescent boys don't produce sperm. So are they not male until they produce, right? There's all these kinds of logical gaps in this kind of thinking. So sex refers to gametes, gonadal apparatus, hormones, sex chromosomes, primary and secondary sexual characteristics. It's this suite of characteristics. And then gender identity is a neuroanatomical construct. There is such a thing as experiencing being male or female. It is correlated with specific brain structures. And so that's being trans is when your sex and gender identity do not align. That's all. So when you have a trans woman, that is the vernacular that we have developed to refer to somebody that was born of male sex but has female gender identity. We refer to them as a trans because the sex and gender identity do not align, and then we refer to them as trans women as a courtesy to dignify them, right? So if it's a linguistic thing, it's never the case that conservatives acknowledge what I just said about male sex, female gender identity, but let's not call them trans women. It's always just, you're denying biology and all this stuff. It's absolutely not the case. They just absolutely want to stick to this third grade understanding of boy's penis, girl's vagina and refuse to look at any of the science that is referenced and just continue going, you think men can have babies. Which men? What are you talking about? Are you talking about cis men? Because no, nobody has ever said that. Are you talking about trans women? Because no, nobody has ever said that. Are you talking about trans men? Yes, they can because they have uteruses because they are a female sex. So it's nothing but distortion, completely bad faith, absolutely refusing to engage with any of the commentary. And then they hide behind, unfortunately, figures like Dawkins and Coyne who have sort of fallen for this anti-woke fad. And they go, see, look, the biologists agree with us. They're just really old and cantankerous and refuse to learn something new.
So the anti-religion view that Dave had as a 6-year-old is supposed to be obvious common sense. But a third-grade understanding of the difference between boys and girls is somehow ridiculous, even when established biologists such as Richard Dawkins agree with it. To defend his point, Dave argues for showing courtesy, followed immediately by insults at conservatives, the anti-woke movement, and old cantankerous scientists. When people want to believe in a sky daddy, Dave mocks them openly and endlessly, dismissing all their arguments as pseudoscience. But when men want to believe that they are women, Dave demands courtesy and actively promotes newly invented, ideologically motivated science. Therefore, it seems that Dave's current priority is not so much science communication, but rather he is focused on pushing his personal worldview, while using his limited science knowledge as a tool of intellectual intimidation. This is also evidenced by his lengthy commentary on Israel, which is in no way a scientific matter. In fact, rather than just being a science communicator, Dave seems to have taken upon himself a borderline messianic calling.
It's such an immaculate example of the precise brand of anti-science rhetoric that is rampant in society today. It's a manipulative epistemological poison that has the potential to kill off the human race. I do find that as many great science communicators as there are, I don't think that enough of them are really aggressively going after misinformation. I think there are a lot of channels, and no criticism on them, because everybody should be able to decide their own style of communicating science. But I think that some very lightly go after misinformation in a very safe way, so as to avoid attracting a lot of negative attention and a lot of the hassle of the trolls and all of that stuff, which is fine. But I would encourage more people to do it, not necessarily exactly how I do it. I know I'm very abrasive, but find some way to really target these people and try to neutralize them, because it's an enormous problem. It's honestly, I may be a bit biased, but I think it's the #1 problem in the world, is misinformation, and that people can't seem to figure out what's true. It could be the thing that takes us down as a species.
Dave believes that misinformation is an existential threat, and he is the one who valiantly fights it. He does so by aggressively promoting a childish view on religion, confidently reading out loud complicated equations that he doesn't understand himself, refusing to understand arguments that oppose his own worldview, and insulting expert biologists who disagree with him on his trans ideology. And then he complains that somehow people do not trust scientists anymore. It must be because they're dangerously stupid, so Dave needs to neutralize them. Dave's doomsday thinking reminds me of Solzhenitsyn's warning. If I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, "Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened." To avert such an existential threat, everything is permitted, including the hijacking and weaponizing of science. From this perspective, it seems that Dave has more in common with hyper-religious pseudoscientists than he likes to admit. Personally, I think both warnings are worth taking seriously. It is important that people are sufficiently capable of proper scientific reasoning, as well as moral reasoning, and assessing historical evidence. However, I'm not convinced that Dave contributes positively to any of these issues.